1 versus 4. The objective is down, and what can he do? The answer is nothing.
The way I got into gaming, I knew that I didn't want to just work in the clinical environment. I would follow the professional esports scene, and I realized that I could just combine those two passions, gaming and health and wellness. I'm Matthew Hu, and I'm a physical therapist working in esports.
All right, so my first question, really kicking this off as broad as we possibly can, and I'm curious on what your thoughts are, because you work with a wide range of teams, or you have worked with a wide range of teams through 1HP, working on PT work, with your performance company as a whole. You've had that exposure to teams, and one of the hot topics right now is building performance systems, player development, all that type of stuff. And because it's a hot topic that is brand new and none of us know the answer to it, I'm curious, and what is your current thoughts on like the player systems that teams are trying to create, as well as like the current approach to player development as a whole? Again, kind of like a broad question, but we'll probably get more narrow than that.
Can you clarify what you mean by player systems? Do you mean just like the training schedule? Do you just mean top to bottom, like how they approach scouting to managing players day to day? Like what are you referencing?
Let's say that the schedules that a lot of teams use for scrims, so taking their tier 1 teams or their primary rosters, and the actual process of building those players into the best competitive team possible through their scrim schedules, the way they operate as a team, anything along those lines. And then I want to get into the idea of scouting afterwards as well.
Okay, yeah. I think, if we just start sort of at the meat of everything, or just the direct impact of, I guess, how training, or the decision or framework or model of training that a lot of these organizations make when it comes to helping their players improve. There's probably like millions of, or not millions, but many variables that come into play. Obviously, coach makes a large impact on the structure of the training schedule, how they envision players are looking to improve. There's also the unique dynamics, I think, to consider of the 5 or 3 or whatever X amount of individuals in the team, to be able to determine like what system would be the most effective. I think it's kind of a red herring to think that it's just a single type of system, because we're dealing with people. But there are obviously mental models that we can take to at least create consistency in helping people learn, or helping people create or establish an environment that's supportive of what we learn about our players at the beginning of the season. And so I think there's a pretty like limited understanding of that general approach at the current state of esports, although it's improving a lot and pretty quickly, with yourself and our organizations and some of the many other organizations out there that are performance minded. But just sort of the idea that you need to understand where your players are at in terms of their perspectives, beliefs on training. And a lot of the times it's even the coaches, right? And that's why our management has a large role in choosing or identifying a coach that has a thoughtful system of creating this environment, because most of the time, from my experience, the coaches still are operating under the previous methodologies of just playing or following into the scrim schedule that the esports title dictates, where this is just how it's been done, right? And so I met actually earlier today with a researcher who in esports, and they're a part of Ep5, who is designing constraints-led approaches to training. And I can, just shout out to Cabs over at Ep5, but I think that this is obviously something that I'm sure you've thought of, many other people have thought of, to try to improve training outside of just hop into scrims, let's do the VOD review after, talk about how we're going to improve on that, and then go from there. I think like just immediately off the top of my head, I know many coaches that have tried no comms. How do we increase, add that constraint into training and automatically force all the players to improve their awareness on each other, right? Because they cannot communicate. That's a forced constraint. So they're forced to learn on how to operate without directly communicating. No verbal communication. And you can do other constraints where it's like no wards. Like, again, an example of League of Legends. how do you operate in a game where you can figure out behavioral cues more easily in lane to identify, oh, maybe this shit is going on, or maybe with this timing I can figure this shit out. That will really teach players, or really teach people, versus let's keep all the variables in a scrim and then try to pick out the learnable experiences there. I think like we're so far behind in trying to optimize skill acquisition or learning in esports that and then, to be honest, people are lazy. People are not willing to work, right? I'm just being completely honest, right? Like you know this. I'm sure you in the 5-6+ years that you've been in esports, there's been many encounters with coaches that are just not willing to work, and that's limiting the development of the industry, the coaching industry.
So when you say not willing to work, are you talking about, like you just mentioned, coaches? Are you talking about players that you see aren't willing to work, or is it more of like management isn't willing to do the work to set up teams to be able to do stuff like the constraint learning or things like that? Like, who's not wanting to work?
Well, when I was specifically talking, I was more referencing coaches, but I think it can come from all stakeholders, right? Like, there's players that don't work, there's managers that are just coasting because they're getting a bag, or there's all reasons and environments that lead to players or coaches or managers being complacent, and so complacency really leads to this: hey, it's just how it's been done, and it's worked, or they've gotten success, and so that creates this false notion that what they're doing is the best, is optimal, right? But objectively, if they just try to zoom out a little bit, there are things that can be improved.
Yeah, I like the word you used, behavioral cues, because I think I don't think we really pay attention to behavioral cues as much in esports as we would in, say, basketball or soccer or hockey. Like, you're always watching body language, and you're very aware of like the way that the cues are setting up to change the way that a play moves. Mm-hmm. And you talk about those types of things, like where the eyes are looking, where the head is moving, where the feet are planted. You talk about those behavioral cues frequently in traditional sports, and the implications or the outcomes of noticing those types of cues so that you can respond your body movement before the play actually happens. And I think using you use no wards in League, using no wards to force yourself to learn the body language or behavioral cues within your lane counterpart.
Yeah,
like, that's an interesting way to approach it. Is something like that starting to work? Like, have you seen a lot of positive output of that, or is it something that's still at like a theoretical stage? Like, we think this could work, but we aren't sure if it does yet.
So this is definitely it's early in the studies, but I think in the study they've already done interventions, and it's shown increased improvement in learning. I can link the article. I was just linked it today, so I need to actually go through it. But it was I think they have the script for their next study, which was more of an intervention approach. I could be wrong, but I just had the conversation today, so I know that constraints-led approach for learning and motor coordination has been a thing for a very long time, and it was something that fascinated me several years ago, and that's sort of how that conversation got brought up in sort of earlier today. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of people trying it, and we've seen success in Overwatch where this has happened, where you have to coordinate with 6 people, and it led to an improvement. And then what happens is the coach tries that, but the underlying intent of them trying it wasn't that, hey, this is a constraints-led approach, it's going to increase this. It's like, they're a bit too toxic or something like that. They don't really have the underlying understanding of why that methodology is beneficial, and so they try it once, it's beneficial, and they're like, oh, great, we got this conclusion out of it that it was good for this one potential situation, whereas it can be a repeated training tool or intervention for them.
Gotcha. Okay, so I'm curious on, research is obviously something that I'm very interested in right now, because part of my work is doing a PhD in studying and researching esports. And I'm curious, the specific topic, I won't go too deep into it, or I should say the broad topic that I'm looking at is fatigue in esports and fatigue, breaking that down into both cognitive and physical fatigue and the implications or the impact that has on esport performance. So one of the things that might be possible in esport or in traditional sports that I'm curious on if it can be transferred over to esport, and I want to get your opinion on this, do you think there's potential value in creating physiological fatigue in a player or a team prior to scrims to induce a stressor so that playing scrims they have to overcome this physical fatigue to focus, maintain whatever effort to maintain all those types of things, and then you fast forward in time when they actually have a competitive match, and because they've trained under a certain physiological stress, they're able to handle the adrenaline, the pressure, the anxiety that emerges in competition. Do you think do you think research should be taking a look at stuff like that, and do you think there's any possible use cases for it within esports?
I think this is a really great question that has a lot of nuance to consider, right? Because I think yes, like objectively, the idea of pre-fatigue or creating stressors, if all individuals are the same in how they perceive stress, absolutely, then yes, it will 100% of the time, be a benefactor because they'll learn how to cope with that stress in the appropriate way. But we know that everyone's different, and so then, to me, the research is identifying individual coping strategies and identifying individual pre-fatiguing interventions that would be beneficial for these different archetypes of coping strategies or individuals, but because there's so many individual factors that come into play when it comes to responding to stress and their mentality and maybe what's their accumulated or acute to chronic stress at that very point in time, that all has to be somewhat monitored to be able to determine the intensity of the type of pre-fatiguing intervention to see if that can be beneficial. And then not only that, it's like, I think you as a performance coach or a coach in the situation has to be present to help your team better process, what they're feeling, because in the moment, some people might just mental tilt and go boom, right, for the rest of the scrim, and it will be unproductive. Or if that's processed appropriately with someone in the middle of the scrim, then it can be beneficial, right? And so I think generally yes, it's a great thing for us to study, but we have a lot left to uncover. It's hard to say where to start. And then I guess my question back to you is where do you think we should start considering, you're doing the research?
Good question. I was trying to get the answer from you. I don't know. I think there's steps that come before that, because I think that there is going to be value in some cases where pre-fatiguing is good for an individual. I think I'm trying to be careful with what I say because nothing is definitive. We don't have the answers on any of this, but I think for somebody who probably struggles with dealing with performance anxiety, if you can get them comfortable with the idea of learning how to play under pre-fatigue and learning how to play games or compete or have good comms or have good aim or have good decision making while they are experiencing some degree of physiological stress, I think that there might be a use case which, again, the person has to be on board with this, because if they are very, very against this idea, it's going to just backfire on you. But if you can convince them that pre-fatiguing might be a way of helping them learn how to cope with performance anxiety, or not preventing it per se, but I feel adrenaline, I feel anxiety, I feel stress, I feel my heart rate racing, I feel the sweats, I feel the jitters, I feel all these things. If we can teach them how to deal with the pre-fatiguing stress in scrims and practices, they might have some degree of better skill at handling it when it sets into competition. Again, I don't know if that's going to be true or not. It might not be true, but I think in terms of where research should go, we should look at those kinds of use cases, because I think that's where, but again, this all comes down to what you said, is everybody is different, and though that might be a good idea, it might work for some people, and other people it might exacerbate the issue even more, because the idea of pre-fatiguing is so egregious to them, or they hate that idea so much, or so uncomfortable, or they have zero buy into it, that all you're doing is antagonizing them. They're now hating practice, they're getting nothing out of it, you're breaking their trust towards you, all of those bad things happen, so all the positive outcomes are just out the window. But I think, again, the place I think there is a place for this in esports if the research says that it has some positive effect, but that has to be very specific to the individual that you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it almost sounds like the first step is understanding where people's awareness is at, right? Like in terms of understanding if they are stressed. Like to be honest, many don't have that awareness. And really how we work, you know, in the professional space, you know, both as a medical provider and or a performance coach, we need to establish a baseline, right? And so the tools that allow us to identify their individual profiles of coping and stress management and stress awareness then can allow us to determine what interventions would be beneficial for them. And so, right, like that's wherein as, you know, real like medical providers or, you know, performance providers, it's our duty to have this methodical approach where we're assessing, we're using and synthesizing that information to determine what's going to be beneficial. And, you know, I think sometimes that can be lost. That can be lost in the passion of a lot of you know, maybe coaches and or performance coaches out there that really just want to push this space forward. But realize, like, I think it's important to have a structure in how you approach things to consistently make, provide benefit to the people that you're working with. I think we're getting a little deep into this, but it's like more about general coaching and coaching structure than it is more about like all the way back to what we initially spoke about, which is like where teams are at in terms of players and player development.
I honestly have no idea what the answers to these things are yet. It's part of the reason why I'm doing my PhD is because I think it's interesting to be looking at these types of questions before there's any answers to it, because I have no idea what the data is going to say. But that kind of leads me into a question that I'm very curious on your thoughts of, and it's still something I'm trying to reconcile in my own head a little bit when it comes to the science, the research, the data, and then the practical application of coaching. So I don't even know necessarily how I'm going to ask this question, so I'm going to stumble over this a little bit because it's a question that's popping into my mind on the fly. And so bear with me for a moment as we get there. In a lot of the more of like the softer sciences within traditional sports, like building culture or dealing with some emotion regulation or some of the player or the athlete issues and some of those things, we come up with best practices by studying the output or the effects of these practices as they're applied to the industry, and then we say like, this is useful, this is not useful, this is a myth, this isn't a myth, whatever it might be. We come up with those things. When it comes to esports, we don't have a lot of this research yet, and so how do we approach something like this coach has this methodology of coaching this team, and it seems to be highly productive. They win championships. They do that consistently. They have maybe not great team dynamics, but they're coping with each other, dealing with each other. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but they're producing the results consistently over a long season. But their methodology of approaching coaching does not match or mismatches what we pull from coaching literature of like, this is how you build a culture or this is how you do something. Like, what do we do in that type of situation where coaching principle or practice is counter to what the literature or the research or the science says a coach should be like?
That's interesting. I mean, do you have an example or thought in mind? Because I think oftentimes, you know, when that kind of case might occur, it may be a result of maybe we aren't shining the light on the appropriate things to identify the factors that are actually leading to the consistency of success. And hopefully that makes sense. But I guess what I'm saying is, for these situations where the coach might be doing something that's counterintuitive to research, maybe we just haven't identified, you know, depending on who's looking, what things were actually working that are consistent with research, or maybe it's just a perspective of who's assessing it. It could be that, or, you know, if it really is counterintuitive, maybe not all the variables were considered, or not the entire picture, or wasn't taken into account to determine and actually have a logical conclusion around why system or intervention worked because this is so new, right? There's so many unique variables when it comes to access in esports to, from players to fans to immediate reactions. And I think it's obviously transitioning or translating to traditional sports now too with social media. But I think there's just a lot of unique dynamics around esports that could be another variable that with these traditional coaching structures can still work, but it would be like a modification when taking those things into account. So I guess without knowing like what specific type of example, it's hard for me to say. But also in general, I wouldn't say like the coaching methodologies and the coaching literature is something that I'm, super up to date on. I think in general,
Yeah.
I am a nerd about it, and I try to learn and I try to follow whatever model. Like, I think there's like the Henriksen model is like one thing I learned and listened to, but I'm not really, that's not my main scope of expertise. So still hard to say, but it's just from my perspective, those are my thoughts.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I think like one of the things that I'm trying to reconcile or figure out or process or go through is that like we create data and information around what works in terms of, again, structuring teams, coaching, building culture, those player development, those types of things. And then it seems like consistently over time, there'll be a coach that emerges and does things that we would assign as like, that's not correct because look at all the evidence of this is how you're supposed to do it. And they emerge and they do their thing and produce a lot of results. And then over time, science then follows them, is like trying to describe or research why they work, and then what they're doing breaks the mold as to what we think. And again, this is a little bit of like a weird topic because oftentimes when someone deviates from that, it ends up creating a really bad team culture, a really bad team in general. But sometimes like people come in and it seems like they break the mold. And I'm just curious on like how do researchers, or how should we approach, or what's your thoughts on like how we should approach somebody who's not necessarily following the literature? And I don't have any specific examples. If one pops up, I'll throw it there. But if they are kind of like carving their own path, but science or research or the literature hasn't caught up to the methodology that they're employing it. So rather than, I guess one of the approaches that I'm thinking about here is rather than prescribing to them what I think coaching looks like based on the research, it's more of just using the research or using future research to then describe why what they're doing works, because what they're doing obviously works. And so I don't necessarily want to get in their way of it. So I don't want to prescribe anything, but sorry, I don't even know where I'm going with that question, but it's a thought that I have when it comes to best coaching practices is how do we enable a coach who doesn't necessarily follow or abide by what the current literature says?
Yeah, well, so I think there's two ways that we can think about this. One, we have to obviously identify, I think there are probably like core competencies of coaching that can probably be established, right? Like there's at least basic things of how people, humans to humans, operate to optimize learning. I think at least at a minimum, some of those things can be and should be considered, or hopefully like you can still push them towards the right direction of how to manage interpersonal relationships. But, let's say they don't and they still achieve a bunch of success. Then I think it's just about truly evaluating all of the variables, right? To more descriptively understand why he's seeking benefit. And so to me, like one of the examples I can think of are, maybe like they didn't find success. Or like, are you saying that someone that consistently finds success, or someone that maybe failed hard but also found some success in another environment, right? And to me, it's like, okay, well, that person had a coaching style that was more fit to this specific environment, which allowed him to be successful. Or this guy was able to be plucked somewhere and put anywhere with any group of players and is successful. Is that like, are we talking more about the latter?
Maybe not. More. I think with that, somebody who, as a coach, actually no, let me change this. It's somebody that might have not found success in any given team, but in the right team environment, they are doing something that is counterintuitive to what we know about coaching, but for some reason is working well within this roster.
Okay.
Like, do we then want to shift the way that coach is thinking or approaching things because the research says this is not how, or this is how a coach should be, but it seems to be working here? Or so do we just like allow them to thrive in their own processes and just support them in there? So I guess from that framework.
So I have an actual example of this. I have a real
Hit me.
live example from Overwatch League. Again,
Cool.
I don't think there's any reason why we can't share the details of this. It was it's out there. There, the Overwatch League team head coach for the LA Valiant for one split went 0-7. Like he lost every. Or I think it was like whatever. They just never won any game. Okay, he was in a team that was of 3 different cultures: French, Korean, and North American. Okay, and he was a full Korean coach. Okay, and he had also 2 assistant coaches that one was Australian and one was also like American. And so it was difficult because multiple cultures, they needed to try to create a combined system to be effective. Okay, and then but fast forward 1 year later, this guy went to China, to the Shanghai Dragons, Coach Moon, and became the best coach. Literally the number 1 team in the league. Didn't change how he operated. And I would say the way that this guy coached was more the I'll let my team figure it out type of coach.
Okay.
Where in the VOD review, he'll kind of say, I think some Korean coaches kind of have the approach where it's like they just point out mistakes, which I think was done. But it was a combination of pointing out mistakes and just letting them figure it out. Not even, I don't even think it was like very thoughtful ways of guiding people towards a specific thought pattern. More just, I'm not going to do as much and just, we'll see how it works. We'll see what they figure out. Or maybe some of the assistant coaches bring up some ideas and it leads to a certain thing. But I don't know actually the internal workings of how this coach operated in China. But, from my perspective, that's his coaching style. And he succeeded because, who knows, but maybe the culture in these Korean and Chinese teams are more, they're maybe a bit more independent, or maybe or maybe it was just those group of individuals that seem to respond to that type of coaching. And for researchers, it's identifying, okay, wow, like let me sit in the room and observe what did he do, and what were these players' styles, like what seemed to help them achieve a certain objective in the game more quickly. But not only that, what was the baseline of these 6 players, and where were they at before, and what was the difference? Because maybe they were just great. Maybe the scouting was great, and he just got lucky, right? There's all these variables that could have come into play. But he was a good coach. Shanghai was good, I think, for a while after that. But even before that, they were 0. They also lost every game of that stage, but it wasn't from him. So. Yeah, it's just an interesting story, I think, to
that's
consider.
Cool. I like that. And my thoughts on this, or like the reason why I asked this question is because, and again, bear with me on this a little bit, but I tried to be, as a coach, as evidence-based as possible because I don't want to hurt players. I don't want to get in their way. I don't want to cause any problems. Like, I want to make sure that I do the most effective practices I possibly can in order to create a healthy and thriving team. Sometimes what I see is that a coach is one step ahead of where, and this is again talking about the softer sciences, so not like the PT or injury side of things, like the coaching side of things. So they are one step ahead of where science is, and so like what they are doing has not yet been described or explained or researched. So even though what they're doing doesn't have evidence within the literature, it is still highly effective. And I'm trying to figure out, like, at what point do I need to just step back and be like, man, literature might not be explaining what he's doing yet, or it might not have researched or gone through this type of strategy yet, and I just need to get out of their way and support them. And at what points do I need to step in and make sure it's like, yeah, dude, like you're very much setting your players up for failure because of what you're doing, and trying to figure out where that point is of, like, again, letting them go with their methodology because, like, the research just hasn't caught up to what they're one step ahead of it, or do I step in because what they're doing is definitely going to cause harm to their players, and trying to figure out when which of those circumstances is occurring.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think it's like time scale of how they're approaching and what are the results, right? Like what are the outcomes that his or her approach is leading to. And like, yeah, you can look at it a week at a time, or you can look at it 6 weeks at a time, and sometimes that's the whole season. But maybe they were onto something, and maybe in a multi-split situation they actually will have peaked. And so it's hard, it's really difficult because you have to balance all those variables.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's all about just kind of assessing, like, is like regulating ourselves to see, is this the right time to make that, like, have him consider a different approach, or maybe I'm just stuck within the constraints of this culture for right now and I can only support him, or hey, he's doing something right and I should just support him, right? Because there's all of those things that occur in esports where it's like sometimes you're just in a environment where management has way more say about certain things, and so the coach doesn't feel empowered to be able to do something, and so you can try to help, but ultimately you have to work all the way up to the top to convince them to let your coach be more free reign. And so it's never simple, I would say, but like in a more like ideal managerial environment, I guess, or organizational environment, it's probably a bit more clear, when you have full support from the org and you have the capacity to kind of make those decisions and have the trust to do that. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So you're touching on a point that I want to come to in the future of this conversation of like organizational structure, management either hurting or helping their players. I want to come to that, but there's a couple other things I want to pick your brain about on what we've been talking about, because you also mentioned with the Shanghai Dragons, that you said the team. So with the Shanghai Dragons, that guy went in, he thrived, he had a little bit more of a hands-off approach, was like, you figure it out, sort of guidance or support, or saying like, this is what you're doing wrong. One of the things I think that's different between esports and traditional sports is the fact that, I don't know if this is the right term for it, players are kind of more high IQ when it comes towards the game, whereas in traditional sports, players are often there to just like pass ball, go, and I will tell you how to play the game, or like the coaches dictate a lot of the strategy and the plays and that kind of stuff. And so
for sure,
do you think there's a world in which esport coaches are less of coaches in the traditional sense, where they're coming up with everything, they are the end all be all of the plays within a team, and they're more or less just people there in place to contain the team as the team goes out and solves all these problems themselves? They come up with the plays, they come up with the solutions, they do all those types of things, and they're actually the ones solving the game itself? Or do you think it's more, and I'm kind of this is kind of like a loaded question, I suppose, because the answer is going to be, it depends on the team, obviously, but or do you think it's better that the coach is the one that is coming up with ideas, that is solving the game, and then imparting that knowledge on their players?
Well, I think like if we zoom out, like we can really see where we are in the state of coaches being in esports, right? Like you can say it's kind of early. We're on like the first iteration of new age coaches that are ex-players, that actually have a higher level understanding of the game, where previously it might have just been like an analyst that just really enjoyed the game. Now we have, more and more individuals as understanding and deeper understanding of these games have been developed, where you can actually study and have that role where the coach or the coaching team does have that strategic approach. But as you said, it does depend, right? It depends on the group. It depends on the esport title and how developed it is, because some esports titles are really player driven, where they will make a majority of the decisions and the coaches don't really have a say. I think kind of Call of Duty somewhat has that within its culture, although that's changed more recently with more coaches trying to take up more of that strategic approach role than just sort of being, bumper rails to guide them towards the right decision. But yeah.
I asked this question because I think it was the first episode that I shot with Call Out from the SSG R6 team. His coaching style is very much like me and the assistant coach. We will go solve the game. We'll do the strat planning. We will do all of these things so that you are enabled to go and be the best player you possibly can. And so it's like enabling the players to purely focus on the mechanics, the execution, the synergy between each other, the timings. Like their idea is like we want to free up players like cognitive load so that they can be the best player they can be. And if they have to go out and solve the maps, they have to solve the strats, then we're putting load on them when they could be actually focusing on just playing the game. And so they take that approach, and I consider them to be a very successful coaching strategy or team and a very successful coaching strategy because they do really good work, great operations internally with how that dynamic actually works. That being said, I've also seen the opposite of that. I have other coaches who it's very much like, I am here to set you guys up for success, but I am not here to give you the information. I am here to help you. I'm almost here to ask you questions so that you go out, you come up with an idea, you solve that question, and then you see that your answer was wrong. So you try something new, and that was wrong as well. And you try something new, and that was wrong. And then, boom, there we go. Now you finally got the answer. And they're more of like a guide and a question asker so that the players go out and come back with the solutions. And also, I think like those coaches are phenomenally successful as well. And so that's why I said it's kind of like a loaded question because I know it depends, but it's interesting to see the difference in coaching strategies both be effective depending on the roster that they have. Because I'm sure that call-outs approach with some rosters is probably not going to work because that roster wants less information. They want to go solve for themselves. And for some rosters it works really well. And then the reverse is true where more of like that guide question asker, the players just need more information, so there's a lot of tension and friction between the players and coaches because what the players need is not what the player coach is doing. And I think a lot of this goes into, I'm kind of going on tangent now, I think a lot of that understanding which coaching strategy or coaching methodology needs to be used needs to begin before the team is even built, because as you are recruiting players, in my opinion, I think you need, right? Like, there we go. Now we're going to get on a different topic too, is scouting, because I think
this is it.
As you pick up players or as you look for players, you need to have in mind the type of coach you have or the type of coaching you want so that the 5 players you get are aligned with that type of strategy. Otherwise, there'll always be that constant tension. And I think teams don't start early enough. Like, they think about the team culture that they want, like, we're positive, PMA, we're all these types of things. Like, they think about that type of culture, but they don't think about the coaching strategies and will the coach that I have function well with the players that I have. And that's like that's a big point of conflict for a lot of teams that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might have even directly talked about this in a conversation before, but, you know, what immediately comes to mind is, you know, historically in one of the teams that we worked with, you know, I won't name any names, but generally it's just, hey, we knew and identified in a previous season with this certain group of players that they can be categorized as a bit more free-flowing and they don't respond as well to structure, right? You can determine that very early on in probably a conversation or assessing how a player operates in a team environment. And so, you know, in the scouting process, we were kind of helping the coaches understand and management understand that, hey, if you're trying to work with this specific player, you need to have a coach that will be a bit more free-flowing, that, you know, the structured approach will not work with this player. And, you know, that was all said and done. They did the opposite. What played out was exactly what we told them would play out, in that they did not respond to the structured approach. It was causing problems. That player was let go, right? And so it's like, hey, you know, we actually, you know, as performance providers or healthcare providers or, you know, psychologists can identify these things before you make the decision. We can save you money, guys. Esports winter in the house. Esports winter, okay? We can help you make better decisions that will have better long-term value for your team and your organization if you just assess at the appropriate time and not just look at, you know, numbers on a paper, right? Yes, I'm sure they assess and ask about, you know, how they respond in training, but they don't have the perspective of a esports psychologist or you know, or from the perspective of a performance professional to say, hey, like, this is what you can consider And this is how you can expect the team's dynamic to potentially be. Yes, there's more variables, but at a minimum, we can start from a better base. And that's where I think a lot of scouting can be improved in esports, because we're pretty far behind, I would say, on how we approach
pretty
things.
dog shit at it?
Yeah, pretty dog water in terms of, even just like there isn't structure sometimes. Sometimes it's just like, damn, he's good. Oh, imagine if we could get this guy and this guy. Yo, their YouTube clips combined would be sick. Like, if that's the extent at which we're deciding rosters and you're expecting a fiscal ROI, maybe, we should be the ones making these decisions.
Well, even like, I kind of hinted that I want to get into the topic of organizations and hurting or helping players, but even if we look more in like the hurting or helping player side of things too, if you know that the player that you're about to pick up is going to be hurt by the structure that you have, and they're going to lose their job, they're going to be in a position that makes them miserable, it's going to hurt everybody around you, like, you can avoid a lot of pain for your players as well, just by having better scouting, because you're going to put people in a position where they can thrive, they're happy, they're healthy, they're high performing, they're doing all these things, whereas I think teams will often jump the gun because of all the stuff you just said. Now they get a player, 6 months, 12 months down the road, that player is just like suffering because they aren't clicking with the roster, the things just aren't going smoothly, and now you've caused harm to a player. Obviously it's not intentional harm, but like, it's still like that player eventually suffers as well as a result of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think there's multiple reasons why there's this lack of approach, and it's not always the fault of the scouting team. It's just the fact that we're still early. There's a lot of individuals that, may be thrown into this position that don't necessarily have the right background or experience to be able to make the right decisions in terms of scouting, and or, it's not historically their competency, and then they just have to do it because of the current nature of esports, right? And so it's not always their fault, but ultimately there is responsibility on the organization to create that assumption, or create that at least expectation that it should be at a baseline approached in a certain way, and that means it requires that person to be educated enough about the topic. And that's why there needs to be education in general about this to all those stakeholders that have to want to learn. They have to want to be willing to improve their program, but also, that scouting has to speak to how it can actually be beneficial in terms of, financial ROI, right? And that's not always easy for researchers to be like, hey, this is the best for performance, but financially, in esports right now, how can I justify paying you to implement this if it's going to take 3 years? I just cannot, fair. Right? And so, those are obviously the true limitations.
So with scouting, you said, like, this is one of the things we can see, like, when you're talking about that structured or free-flowing approach, you're like, you gave advice, you're like, these are things that we can scout out or that we can identify very early on in the process. Like, there's ways that I'll go about scouting or looking for those types of things. So I'm curious, like, when you say, like, we can identify these things early on, you don't have to give any trade secrets here or anything like that, but, like,
I'll give them
how do you go about doing something like that? Or let's pretend like I'm one of your COD or LCS or Overwatch coaches. How would you recommend to me to be able to identify something like that in a player, to know that, like, one, I have to have the awareness of, like, the type of coaching strategy that I use. So let's say that I'm more of, like, a free-flowing coach. So how do I, as a free-flowing coach, go about identifying players who need more structure and those who are more free-flowing, so that I can recruit based on the right criteria?
So, I think that obviously I come from the physical performance side of the discipline. It's more that my interactions with a lot of esports psychologists and performance psychologists and sports psychologists have allowed me to at least develop the approach that we should take. I don't know the exact details of the assessments, but
that's fine.
What we should do is, and anyone can do this, it's not a trade secret here, is you have to
create an objective way to identify consistency in the performance of certain habits and use a scale. And it doesn't have to be truly validated or reliable, but at least we're working from a point where you're determining some level of objectivity about a certain player's behavior. So, for example, you can say, I could probably pull out some stuff, but maybe there's a category of communication with teammates or communication with coach, and you can identify based on how they communicate that they will more consistently be willing to learn on this sort of certain style, or they will be at a 3 out of 5 inconsistent in their behavior around something relating to communication. And you can do the same thing with teamwork. You can do the same thing with resiliency. You can do the same thing with coping strategies. 1 to 5. It doesn't have to even be 1 to 5. It can be from diamond to challenger. However you want to do it. You can still create an objective measure to say, hey, look, this is the radar plot of what we see in terms of how this player operates. This is their profile. And by the way, for all teams and organizations watching, we, myself and Landon probably too, we have our own system. So, if you want to work with us, we can help you identify that and, make more intentional decisions about your players. But, getting back into it, right? Like ultimately that's the goal. You need to be able to say 1 to 5, 1 to whatever. This is how they're behaving. And look, we can reasonably look to improve that. And this is what they do for Olympic athletes in Canada. Literally, Carl Thibault is the one that shared this information to me to help me better understand how they approach performance for the athletes. It's all about consistency in performance of certain behaviors and that being objectified, and then assessing pre, mid, post season, to be able to make decisions. Hey, this guy's at risk because he doesn't do anything. He's an idiot, Let's address
Classic.
that, right? So again, like that's at a minimum, right? Like things that can be done that just take a little bit of work.
Yep. Okay, so follow-up question. Again, I'm pretending like I'm the coach. So I'm the coach. I now have my scales of resiliency, communication, all those things. I now have my scales, and I'm looking to scout out a player. Are these things that I, as a coach, are sitting there like grading, almost like grading this person as they're going through trials on? Or is it something that I'm going to that player and be like, where's your communication skills at? What type of team structure? Am I asking them, or am I just grading them?
This is a really good question, because this is where the art comes in of how you, as a performance provider, leverages the research or leverages what you know about the game and the training structures to create something. Create a scouting tool, create a scouting boot camp, create a scouting 5v5 training environment with certain stress constraints, maybe a pre-fatigue constraint to see how they respond under stress, right? Like maybe you have a confederate inside the team that actually tries to tilt people, and then you see how they respond to it, right? Like there's things that you can do to literally tease out specifics in personality, specifics in their profile to say, all right, this guy does not respond well. Like,
absolute asshole.
Let's put together 5 tilters and let's see what happens. You guys can do that.
Five tilters will clearly come together as one calm roster.
Yeah,
guaranteed.
Exactly. Or you can roll the dice, and then later on, whatever esports journal, they'll be like, "Oh, this was fated to be one of the best rosters. What happened?"
Are you trying to poke at a couple of teams here?
I don't know. I mean, that's happened millions of times over the
It's happened every season, in every game. That happens with at least 2 rosters every single season. Okay, cool.
So tier list of the potential rosters and how they're going to perform over the season. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
No, that happens in league, especially. I feel like that happens in the LCS every single year, at least once.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, cool. So I like this because, again, part of this is like I want coaches to be more intentional with how they recruit players. And one of the things that I'm trying to like really drill in right now is that if you are more intentional, you will still probably make you'll still probably make a lot of mistakes, but those mistakes will be lower probability and you can course correct much quicker. So let's say that I'm a coach
Exactly.
putting together a 5-person roster. I'm like, this person, this person, this person, this person, and this person. I'm going to put them all together on the roster because based on my criteria, they fit exactly what I'm looking to put together. Chances are you probably fucked up at least one of those decisions, maybe two, and you have 1 or 2 players in your team that you misjudged or whatever, but you got 3 or 4 out of it, and so like your intentional recruitment actually was pretty successful, and you shouldn't be scared of the fact that I made a mistake. You just continue to do or to follow that process, recruit based off of like intentional recruitment processes of your criteria or your scales. And if you make a mistake, that's fine. Just step back and adjust it when the time is appropriate. But I'm really trying to hammer, 1, be intentional when you recruit. But number 2, understand that being intentional, you will still fail. And you can't be scared of like the what if I pick the wrong person. You just have to course correct and continue to trust in that process.
Exactly.
And
And
this
that
is
will
really
help you
cool. You're
improve
actually
more quickly, right? And
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
think something though to keep in mind is like coaches don't know what they don't know, and so if possible, reach out to someone that has a different perspective. You know, preferably like understanding of interpersonal relationships, communication, and or as a part of 1HP. But just find someone that has a perspective that can help you develop better criteria around esports specific performance for your specific esports title, right? People are willing to help. People are willing to share. And
Yeah.
so,
Well,
I think that's an important point to highlight.
That's almost exactly why I'm trying to make this podcast, because that's something that I learned early on in my career, that there is a hell of a lot of things that I have no idea that I don't even know, as well as a hell of a lot of things that I think I know that I don't. And what I learned over the years is that players have information or perspectives that I don't have. Coaches have that same information, perspectives that I don't have. Other performance coaches, doctors, practitioners, healthcare professionals have perspectives and experiences that I don't know. And so what I do consistently is I try and seek out and talk to these people. Is like, teach me what you know, because you know something that I don't, and I want to be able to learn from you. Because me as a performance coach, mental performance consultant, whatever you want to title it, I think there's things that I know, and there's a lot of those things that I would be wrong at. But the only way I'm going to figure that out is if I'm either trying it, practicing it, or actually like talking to other people that have experienced it at some point within their career. And so I think that's great advice, is like actively seek out those in similar positions to you. So if you're a player, go talk to other team players, talk to your teammates. Look at, I think also like you should jump across games and look at, if you're a Val player, go talk to Dota players, go talk to Rocket League players, because they'll probably be able to teach you something about competition that a Dota player never considers or a League player never considers. So like go seek out information from other competitors, as well as like coaches and pretty much anybody you can get your hands on. Like talk to them, ask them questions about how do you handle failure, how do you build teams, what does good team culture look like, how do you fix a team conflict. Just ask them every question you can possibly imagine, because you will learn loads by just doing that.
Yeah, I think like a good way to think about it, maybe you have a mental model, right? And if you're only exposed to people with similar mental models, then how can your model expand? And so, I think that's a really good point to say, like, go reach out to someone that has a slightly different perspective in a different esports title that has different variables, and you will have a transferable gain in your mental model. I just think that's a really good point.
That's the simple quote for that is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That kind of like, if your mental model is the same as people around you, every solution is going to be handled the exact same way. You're not really expanding the tools that you have available to you to solve future problems. So, jumping backwards just a little bit, I think the way that you were describing the selection or like the recruitment process in scouting, it's funny because, again, I'm referencing call out here from SSG. When they were recruiting when they were still Astralis, when they were recruiting for their 4th person to go to SI, they did exactly this. They created and I didn't have anything to do with this, they just did it because they have a really good approach to things, but Callout created a list of variables. I can't remember what was all in that variable. I think it was a scale of 10, and as they were trialing players, every single time they trialed a player, they would do like 2 or 3 trials or however many times it was. Every player had to rate their experience with their trial, the people they were trialing, and they would average that out, and they'd see, like, based on the collective experience of the team, this is how we're perceiving this player. The coach would do it as well, and they would do that for every person over multiple trials. And so you'd get though it's still subjective because it's everybody's perception of this person, you start to see the numbers behind how people think about things. You average that out, you can see like, okay,
Yeah,
everybody
exactly.
collectively thinks that this is a highly intelligent player that just is very low on communication, right? Like you can see those things. So
Yeah,
they
it's
did
brilliant.
that. And then they also had like different plans in place to forcibly tilt people,
Nice.
or to
It's
like
fucking brilliant.
to see if they would purposely go quiet, not dead quiet, but they would stop making plays in the middle of a round to see if the trialee would then start to make calls or fill the void with like, here's what we need to do, here's a solution. They would start to try and like force errors in that way to see how the player would respond. And so they did a lot of the things, and they ended up having a magnificent Siege Invitational run. Got top 4 just because they picked the right person and they went through all of these things. And like
That's cool.
again, I had nothing to do with that. They naturally did those types of things, and like brilliant, like good for them. They did a good recruitment process for it.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really good system.
Yeah. Okay, so I know we're kind of coming up on an hour here in a second, but there's a topic that I really want to go into because you, again, have an exposure to a lot of different organizations. You've seen the internal workings of a lot of different structures, teams, systems, infrastructure, organizations, management. You've seen all of it. And I'm curious on what your thoughts. I've been alluding to it a little bit throughout the conversation. I'm curious on your thoughts of how do organizations either harm or help their players thrive? Because I think we'll often see players go into an organization and they come out battered and bruised, or they're struggling, or they didn't thrive there. So what types of things do organizations typically do that hurt their players? I'm kind of thinking about this as like hypothetically, let's say that I owned an organization and you were giving me advice. So how would I go about not harming the players within my organization? And also, what should I be doing to make sure that I am giving them the resources, the support, the tools, the ecosystem, the infrastructure, so that they as a player can not just like come in and play for me, but can actually thrive and grow as an individual? Because I think this is a question that all organizations want to make sure that they're nailing, because obviously nobody wants to hurt their players, and obviously everybody wants their players to pop off. So how does an organization set up their infrastructure from a management perspective to make sure that the players can actually thrive and not be harmed while they're there?
Yeah, good question. I think that every organization has their unique value prop, and each sort of brand and the values that come with it have a contributing effect on, expectations for this certain individual. And so, like, for example, you can say, hey, maybe 100 Thieves versus a FlyQuest that, is just sort of new, may not have as much, I guess you can say, clout in the space. There's not as much expectation to play under that banner. That's one thing, right? You have to be aware of what your organization is bringing and what the reputation and everything that comes along with that, so that you can accurately establish the roles and the boundaries that come within each respective player, or like within the coaching role, within the scouting role, within the player role, because a lot of the times that gets lost. And you can set the roles and you can set the boundaries, but you also need to ensure that there's a check system to ensure that that's consistently implemented or integrated on a regular basis. So, and you can just say that it's a culture of being accountable for your own role or your own responsibility, right? Like, hey, as a coach, you're meant to be doing this. And, if someone steps out of that role, both parties should be open to communicate and speak about being accountable to their own scope of work or scope of practice, right? Like, if I'm going and delivering some mental performance guidance and there's a mental performance provider on staff, they wouldn't be happy about that, and ideally I would want them to speak to me about that, and vice versa, and so there's a lot of it's really important for organizations to appropriately set the boundaries for the respective roles so that players can operate within that and understand the expectations that come along with them being a part of that organization. Because if they don't set that, they can sort of fall into a certain behavior of patterns that might not match, what they're supposed to do as players, or one player might have to have a lot more obligations as a internal leader when they didn't really sign up for that. Again, it all has to be defined, and if it comes to supporting structure, that also has to be defined. There has to be very specific, like a flow chart, as medical providers too, to ensure that they get the best care that they need. For example, like if we work with a team and there's a flag or referral that's needed, we have an internal athlete management system that tracks that communicates that to the coaches, so that and also allows for the coaches to understand how quickly those referrals are being followed up on, right? And so in those situations, you need to have the appropriate communication, but that system needs to be set from the organization side to say, if there's a medical issue, go to this guy. If there's a psych issue, go to this guy. For an analyst or interpersonal coaching issue, we need to bring in the coach plus the 2 players, right? And that also involves the coach to have the competency to manage that. But again, the organization determines if that's the type of system that they want for their team. And so I think that's a lot, but I think the TLDR is roles and responsibilities matter.
Do you think organizations are getting better at this? I'm kind of like torn on this, because I think personally, I do think organizations are getting better at this. But as we get better at this, I think that it makes all of the failures or the issues even more apparent, because like we're slow, kind of like the Dunning-Kruger, I suppose. Like as we're improving on it, we're starting to uncover all of the things that we have been failing on. So I guess my question is do you think we as a industry are slowly getting better at this at an organizational level, or do you think we're stagnant? Do you think we're regressing? What's your thoughts on how this is progressing?
Yeah, I think there's progress. I think there's without a doubt progress. Like we compared to 8 years ago when I first started, there's absolutely a bit more forethought about this kind of thing, because it's been brought up so many times, so it has to be in the thought process of the organizations. But the level at which the systems are defined as a result of that awareness are at varying levels, right? And so that's why there's differences in organizational quality at the very moment, right? So you can have the information, but how you execute on that is a completely different story. And there's still varying levels of competency, and there will always be varying levels of competency until we can establish a standard at which these individuals should meet these certain roles in management, right? Like I think one of the problems in esports was like a lot of the times people ascend to these roles when they might not be ready. A lot of the times it might be, I was an existing coach, and there's not really any other people, so I'm just going to be a general manager now. Or I was a team manager, and I didn't really develop all the skill sets of budgeting and negotiating and managing contracts, but I'm the only person available right now, so I'll learn. And that's what happened in esports, and so like they're forced to, again, not always to the fault of their own, but just by the pure nascency of the industry that lended itself to needing these individuals to wear multiple hats. But then there's always the case. There's always going to be bad actors coming in too that might say they have the competency, but may not actually have that. And so that's just something both organizations. Organizations have to be wary of, as they proceed in this space.
I don't know if I ever told you this story, and I've told a lot of people the story, but I think it's the first time I'm actually telling it on on content.
Great.
When I first came into the industry, I pretty much just full sent into it. I moved across the country. I went to Toronto because I was from Western Canada. Moved to Toronto because that was at the time where it seemed like the densest part of esports was for the Canadian ecosystem, and I started attending events and panels and all sorts of things, as you do early career. And very, very early on, I went to a panel that had I don't know if you know. Have you heard of Chris Overholt?
No.
He was the CEO for Overactive Media, so Defiant, Ultra, Mad Lions.
Okay.
He was the CEO from that. I think his previous position to that was the president of the Canadian Olympic Committee. So
cool.
Very, very very well respected dude, CEO of Overactive Media, parent company to the Defiant Ultra and Mad Lions. So he was on the panel, and this was one of the again, this was very early on, one of the first times I've actually come face to face with the CEO of a big company in esports, and I'm just outside my education. And after the panel's over, I find my way up to him, and I'm sweaty, I'm nervous and everything like that, and I shake his hand. I'm like, hey, I'm Landon. This is the type of work I do. Are you guys looking for something like this at Overactive Media with Ultra and Defiant, Mad Lions? And so I kind of gave him like my quick elevator pitch, and it went terrible. I was nervous. It was bumpy, whatever. It was fine. Didn't end up getting the role, obviously. They had just hired Martina, who still works with them, phenomenal at her job. They just hired her, so like they weren't looking for anybody. But I consider to this day that failed pitch as one of the best things that could have happened to me, because I know that I was not looking back now, I was absolutely not ready to be at that level of position, because I just didn't know what I was doing at that point. So I had the education, but I didn't have the practical application piece yet. So I needed to start very low. I need to work with local communities. I need to work with like the Smash or the FGC communities. I need to work with local organizations and slowly build up that expertise over time. I'm kind of rambling, but it's to your point of like people ascend before they're ready for it. And for me, again, personally, it's like I think one of the greatest blessings was that I failed that pitch and I didn't ascend too quickly, because it taught me a lot in the process of having to like kind of build from there. I learned so much about the applied side of things, and I think it ultimately, by not skipping that early step, made me a better coach, because I actually like learned how to fail. I saw what worked, what didn't work. I became a better coach in the process of that. So in a weird way, I was devastated at the time, but again, I think that was one of the greatest blessings, was that I just didn't get that job because I shit the bed with that pitch. But yeah, that was, just on your point of like people ascending too early, is I think I was trying to ascend too early, and that would have been miserable, because I think I would have probably torched my own reputation, because I just didn't know what I was doing, and that's that's the core of it.
That's a blessing in disguise, man. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It was 100%.
You know, I think my background story is definitely obviously a bit different, because I just went into it, but the way that I approached it was like I didn't take a role that would, you know, where I had a lot of responsibility, but it was more like, let me work on the periphery to learn, and then ultimately work up to a point where I can slowly be integrated. And I think so at least like I felt like that for me made sense, instead of me sort of coming in to say, hey, like this is just how it will work, you know, naive. I was still obviously very naive then too, and made poor decisions. I fucked up many times, you know, and so it was just it's interesting thinking back that, you know, the way that, you know, maybe we both came into the scene was probably a bit better for us in the long run to you know, make more of an impact, but also have a measured sort of understanding of the needs of the sport or esport.
Okay, I got. What's the biggest fuck up you've ever done in like your early days? Like, what's the most like I guess like what's the thing that makes you cringe the most of like, I can't believe I did that?
Let me see. I think what I did was, you know, I tried to implement things like a morning routine and a pregame warm-up without setting the appropriate baseline of knowledge. I was just sort of like, hey, this is gonna work, and or like, you know, because that was very early. I was just like, this is gonna be beneficial because it's found in the research, and you know, I had trust with the coaches, so I just kind of applied it, but I didn't try to ease it into the players. I didn't educate them appropriately. I didn't help them process why it was beneficial, and so it led to not a loss of trust, but it led to, like, you know, players not feeling that it was beneficial because there was no approach to manage how they were feeling or manage why they might have felt certain ways after, you know, being a bit more exhausted, and how that can have long-term benefit versus short-term benefit. But like, I just think there wasn't as much of I was too
excited to implement some strategies that I found in the research without thinking how to actually actively execute on it.
Yeah, fair enough. I hate thinking back to some of those things because just like that's a different person, man. Like I'm not the same coach as that guy anymore.
Exactly.
Very cool. All right, well I think we're well past an hour now at this point, so I think we can probably wrap it up there. Really appreciate your time. I know you have a very unique perspective compared to the people who are typically on this podcast, just because we're usually like it's players, it's coaches, and so coming from the performance infrastructure side of things and seeing how organizations function, I think you provide a really big insight. And again, for a lot of the coaches out there, the things that you were talking about like scouting, building teams, the way that organizations function, I think a lot of these things are very practical ideas or tools that almost anybody can employ. Because like even if you're like an IGL for a team, you can be thinking about how do we recruit for our new smokes player, our new jungler, our new whatever it is. Like you can be thinking about these things. You don't have to be the coach, but I think these are just like very practical lessons that almost anybody can employ. And I just want to say, like as the last thing, one of the things that you said that I think everybody really should be doing consistently, and we talked a little bit about this, is going to seek knowledge from other people around you. Like I will do that until the day I die. I will do it with pretty much anybody that is willing to talk to me, because no matter how much I know, other people have experiences that I don't have, or they have knowledge or expertise or perspectives that I don't have, and you can continually always learn by learning from those around you. So if there's one point you take away from this, actually take away 2 points. One, go talk to people, learn from people, consume knowledge. And then the second thing is learn how to scout players, because that'll save you a lot of pain and a heartache in the future. So exactly. Those are the two big things. Is there anything final you want to say before we sign off?
No, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it. I think, if you've listened this far, hopefully, it's been beneficial for you. I hope if you want, you can please let us know, reach out to us, what was beneficial for you, what really, was sort of an aha moment for you. I'd love to kind of learn from your perspective what you guys are taking away from this type of conversation, because it's so different than obviously what I'm used to in terms of like really digging into maybe just topics on injury prevention, or nutrition or sleep or health related things. So I am curious for the audience, if you guys want to reach out to me or tag both of us on social media, just let us know what you guys learned, because that's just something I'm curious as to what you guys might have taken away from this.
Beautiful. And on that point, we definitely need to have another one of these conversations, because I do want to go into those of like injury prevention, health, exercise. I think there's another episode that we can film just on those topics. So something like that will probably come out for the future for anybody that's interested in it, because I definitely want to hammer on those topics as well. But with that being said, again, appreciate your time so much. Thank you for coming to talk with me and sharing your expertise, and looking forward to doing this again sometime.